Thanks for coming in, Brian. I think one of the interesting things here is with the updates to the EPA rules, we're transitioning from a world where we're largely looking at companies measuring emissions, to know more, to do better, but now it's very quickly going to be a dollars and cents issue.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, especially with proposed Subpart W and the IRA under the emissions fee, the methane fee, very quickly you can have an event, a single event that might cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe millions of dollars in 2024 when you start having to pay fees.
Wow. So let's unpack that. I guess there's so many different moving pieces here. You have the other large release events. You have the super emitter response program. You have updates to LDAR under Quad B. And then you have obviously revised factors and practices under Subpart W. So I guess one of the biggest ones when we're looking at it, at least when we're talking about dollars and cents, is the other large release events. And I guess just let's take a step back to unpack that and tell me where I messed this up. There's really two thresholds by which you'll have to report an other large release event. One, if you have any sort of leak that has a flux greater than 100 kilograms per hour, or if the cumulative emissions from an event are greater than 250 metric tons of CO2e. If either of those two are true, then it has to report as an other large release event. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. It's important to note that the 100 kilograms an hour is methane, so it's not a CO2e. You don't have to do that calculation. It's methane itself. But yeah, those numbers are correct, and they sound pretty high. But you take the example, and Dan Zimmerly put out a great LinkedIn post, right, about the 250 metric tons and how many days it might take at a given emission rate to exceed that. And if you're not looking frequently, you're going to miss that opportunity potentially. And those fees, again, rack up extremely quickly.
Yeah. So I guess before we go any further, these are just proposed rules. They're not final rules, just to caveat that.
Yes.
Right. And so I guess dollars and cents, let's try to unpack this a little bit more. I know we were chatting a little bit before we hopped on. If there's a very large release event, let's just say like 200 kilograms per hour, which is large, but compared to some of the stuff you see from satellites, like not necessarily extreme. If you were assumed, or I guess it is assumed that the event was occurring since your last LDAR inspection. Is that correct?
Potentially. I think it depends on how you find it. So let's say you had an aerial or satellite find that 200 kilogram release. You might have to go back to the last time that technology flew over that site to see if it was there at that given time. If there wasn't a time frame where that satellite went over there, you might have to report back up to 182 days. Again, that's another proposed time frame, but half a year. So you might just have to assume that event had been occurring for 182 days.
So if you don't have information or very credible information to the contrary,
yes,
this can expand pretty quickly, meaning the time bound is pretty wide on that event. So at 200 kilograms per hour, then in this case, we're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of like $800,000-ish at $900 per ton, and then, escalating pretty quickly from there, right?
Yeah, I think by the time you get to $1,500 a ton, you're looking at $1.3 million around for one event. That's just one event if it's picked up under those numbers that we talked about. It's a significant amount of money. Of course, that assumes you're over the 0.2 methane intensity. So we have to make that caveat as well.
That's a very good caveat.
Yeah, so you have to be subject to the fee. And then that was what the methane fee would be.
And we'll get into that in a second when we talk about Subpart W. But I guess then let's talk about the alternative technology, because continuous monitoring is just one. It was discussed in the preamble, if I remember correctly, but it wasn't actually specifically outlined. How should we think about that?
Yeah, it wasn't very clear. It's pretty vague in the preamble on how they would allow operators to sort of time bound these events, right? So what will an operator be able to say, or what data will they be able to provide to say, here's when it actually started. We're not going to go back 182 days. We saw it start last week. So the EPA will need to clarify, hopefully, in their final rule how operators can use that. But alternative technologies are certainly something that they should be looking for. If a continuous monitoring system, for example, can pick up when an event started, then they'll be able to time bound that. And you might have a significantly lower fee, of course. Say it's a 24-hour event versus 182 days, might only be $5,000 for that particular event versus $800,000. So it could be a significant change in what your financial fee might be.
So a lot of times people are always talking about like ROI, right? For there, you would say like that's 160 delta. And obviously just every single day that the event is occurring for, you could have paid for continuous monitoring, for a year or every few days, whatever it is that you're trying to utilize as well. But I guess given this is not necessarily defined, right? And it may be tied to some of the other stuff we'll discuss in a moment on Quad B and LDAR. I guess it's important to try to go after probably quality measurements. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, I think specifically for this, you want a measurement that's going to tell you exactly, hopefully, when it started, or at least shorten that time frame. So you want a system that's going to have high fidelity and be able to pick up even a small leak, especially if we're talking that 250 metric ton of CO2e. That's to capture those leaks, right, that are smaller but last for a very long time. So you're going to want a type of system that can see those small leaks and be able to pick those up so you can address them long before you ever hit that 250 metric ton.
Yeah, and that's another cool point as well. And the interesting part is there's lots of technologies that check this box. There's some optical gas imaging stuff that is already out or coming out. There's the point sensors, which obviously are dependent on the wind blowing it in the right direction. So obviously there's a squishiness there in terms of the time bound. It may take a day to get the wind going in the right direction. You have LiDAR technology. There's just a lot there. But I guess the other thing is speed is important, which you're touching on as well. So even if you were to find it fairly quickly, right, you may be able to avoid the other large release event altogether. Let's say it's 20 kilograms per hour, and then you'll be able to avoid it altogether. Where if you found it with your quarterly flyover, your semi-annual flyover, you'll probably trip that 250 metric tons of CO2e. Is fair?
Yeah, no, exactly. You're 100% correct. That 250 metric ton of CO2e. So again, you got to apply the global warming potential to the methane, which is 25 times right now, and it proposed to be higher. So you have to look at that over that period of time. So you're going to get there a lot more quickly with a smaller release event that won't trigger for the 100 kilogram an hour of methane, but could easily trigger for the 250 metric tons. So the more quickly you see it and then respond to it and address it, the better chance you have of not having to report under Subpart W for the other large release event.